welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We have come to the end of our little survey of the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. And so a couple of chapters to finish, and we're actually going to
then we dive someplace else, right? A little bit
into
crazy.
another book while we're here, and it makes sense when we get to it.
Yep.
So
yeah, exactly.
So where are we at?
Well, so last week, if we go back to the beginning, right? There's an exile, Egypt, all that happens. The Jewish nation, all the Israelites are wandering around the desert for 40 years. Now they're in the land as part of Joshua, and it's been 5 to 7 years. And there's wars, and we talked about the southern campaign and the northern campaign, and now there's peace.
Finally.
Right, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So now and last week was division of land.
Yep.
So there were 7 tribes that still needed land. They went out, they made maps, they figured out who was going to get what, they divided up the land. What else is there to do? And then also last week, there was the 2.5 tribes that were on the opposite side of the Jordan.
Yep.
They got sent home with a blessing. They made an altar. There was almost a civil war. Right. Big, so we're not diminishing that at all.
Right.
But now it's like, what's left?
Yeah.
I mean, they're in the promised land.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of chapters left. So what could we possibly cover here?
Yeah.
And then when we look at the chapter that we start with this week, we notice a lot of time has passed.
Yeah, chapter 23, verse 1 says that a long time has passed and Joshua is very old.
Right.
So I don't know that we can get a precise thing, but I think we can get a ballpark. And we were saying last time that Caleb was like 85 years old. So let's say Joshua's right around there, 80, 85. Yep. It's been 40 years. He was one of the spies in the land. So we know from chapter 24 that he dies when he's 110. So I think we've got a 25 to 30 year, roughly, 30 to 40 maybe, somewhere in their ballpark between chapter 22 and chapter 23. Right. And that's where we're at right now. So what have we been doing for the last...
No, that's my question.
20, 30, 40 years.
Exactly. And you would think that they would be building cities and population, but also remember the people have never had a house before. Right? These guys have been wandering around the desert for 40 years.
Right.
Not nomads, but nomads, right? I mean, you're not having a house because you got to dismantle it and go to the next place.
Because it was their parents' generation that was in Egypt.
Right.
And previous.
And they did, right. So how do they know how to live, right? Yeah. And they don't. So I think they're trying to figure out life.
Yeah.
When to plant. Egypt to where they're at, it's not that far away, but I'm sure growing seasons are different and, crops are different.
Well, and like you said, they've been wandering around for 40 years, so they have not had...
and been fed.
God's been feeding, right. So they really are starting from scratch at this point. And so, maybe it doesn't take 20, 30, 40 years to do that, but it's, the other thing that's going to happen is that we'll see in chapters 23, 24, and then the first couple of chapters of Judges this week, is that they're supposed to be clearing the land, helping, getting people to evacuate, whatever.
And clearing doesn't necessarily mean taking trees down.
No. I mean,
it's
the
taking people out.
Getting the people, the Canaanites to evacuate, fighting them if necessary, but not, they don't necessarily have to.
Right.
But instead, what happened is we find out that they start to assimilate.
Right. Which is the whole reason God didn't want them in there to begin with.
Right. Yep.
Right. So we see in the chapter, Joshua tells them, and Joshua, not that he's on his deathbed, but he's on his deathbed, right? Yeah. I mean, he's at end of life. So there's some reflection here, and there's also, guys, don't forget, right? And the first one, don't forget the law of Moses.
Yeah.
Of course they forget. Foreshadowing. Don't associate with the nations that remain close to you. Don't worship or bow down to their gods. If you make alliances, if you intermarry, if you're friendly with them, God will no longer help drive these people out of the nations.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Stay loyal to God. And Joshua says, all faithful promises that God made have been fulfilled.
Yeah.
And now we know that the whole promised land isn't what was promised to Abraham,
Right.
but what was promised to Joshua, God saying, I will be with you if you remain faithful.
Right.
God held up his end of the bargain.
The whole thing. Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction when it says that God has fulfilled all his promises. Not every promise that he's ever made,
Right.
even to Israel, but to Joshua and to that generation. Right. Yep, that's a really good distinction.
Yeah, so chapter 24, Joshua assembles the tribes. And last week, you talked, I think you talked a little bit about this last week, right? So we're back to the same place. And where is this place and why is it important?
So Shechem is it's in the tribe of Ephraim, which is sort of like central Israel on the,
So it makes sense,
the west
right?
side
Something
of the Jordan River. That is where that was a major location in Jacob's life. Okay, and so there's it's almost like we're back home, because remember, Jacob and his family was there. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all that was in this land, 500 years ago.
Right.
And so now they're sort of back. They're back to the place where Jacob had some good conversation with God, and this Shechem for a long time became sort of like the place where they worshipped. It was sort of like there was no temple yet. They had the tabernacle, the tent where they built it. Built it up and tore it down while they were moving. So this is where they put it. So this is where they were meeting with God.
Yeah, and it's interesting. God is talking to Joshua.
Yeah.
And it's a history lesson.
Yeah.
Really. And it goes all the way back to Abraham.
Yep.
And I think 17 times God says, I did blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah for you.
Yeah.
For you. So God is letting them know everything that he did for them. And it's kind of an amazing thing in there.
And it's important that they go through this history, because Moses had told this same group in Deuteronomy, you're not special. The only reason you're special is because God chose Abraham, and you get to God through Abraham. Don't think you're special. Don't think that, we're Israel, so we're special. It's because of God's covenant with Abraham that makes you special.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that they forgot. But that's why he keeps going back to Abraham. You're connecting to Abraham, because Abraham is the guy.
Yeah. Well, and he lets them know, let's see, he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, I gave you the land that you didn't work for.
Yep.
I gave you cities you didn't build.
Yep.
And I gave you produce and vineyards and olive groves that you didn't plant.
Yeah. Yep. And what's really cool about that is that concept will show back up in the prophets as they look forward to Messiah's kingdom. You will have stuff that you didn't build and didn't plant. And so this is sort of like a foreshadowing, because this is, of course, from God's perspective, he knows what's going to happen and all that. But humanly speaking, had they done everything they were supposed to do, here's the kingdom being set up. Right? They didn't. Of course, it didn't.
Yeah.
But what he said is actually will happen again in the future. What we're seeing here.
Right. Then there's a cool thing, and I think the same thing happened during the time of Moses, where you have everybody there, and it's like, do we want to follow God?
Yep.
Yes, we want to follow God. And of course, we know the end of the story.
Right.
But it is asking the people and saying, no. Think about this.
Yeah, this is a serious deal.
Do you really want to do this? And I'm sure everybody at the time from their hearts were saying, yes, we do.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting response and
you're right. It's exactly the same thing that happened in Exodus with Moses at Mount Sinai. Are you going to obey all the law? Everything the Lord said we will do. Yeah. Now, hold on. Before you sign your name, let's make sure we understand the terms and conditions. Everything the Lord said we will do.
Yeah. And Joshua says, well, he's jealous. Look, he's going to hold your sins against you.
Yeah.
Yep. Nope. We got it.
We got it. There's a really famous verse, verse 15, chapter 24, verse 15. He actually gives them the out. He says, if you have no desire to worship the Lord, then choose today whom you will worship. Pick the gods that your ancestors worshipped. Because beginning of chapter 24, Abram and his family were idol worshipers down in the Iraq and Kuwait area. Worship them. That's fine. Go back to Egypt. Worship the Egyptian gods. That's fine. But don't think that you can you can split your allegiance. It's either God or it's somebody else. It's not both. And you need to make a decision today. He said, but as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord.
Yeah. 15.
Right? Yeah. Verse 15. And they're like, oh, well, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. He's like, all right. Then, and this is why I think it's so important that we understand the time frame here. If you go down to verse 23, Joshua said, after they, back and forth multiple times, he said, fine. Of course, I inserted that. Yeah. I don't think that's really in it. Fine. Now, put aside the foreign gods that are among you. Right. They'd already started assimilating into the pagan culture around them. And they're all like, we're going to worship the Lord. He's like, you have gods in your tents. No, we're good.
Yeah, but
so he's like, if you really mean it, this is what it takes.
Yep. So Joshua dies. He's buried on his land.
Yep. He's from the tribe of Ephraim.
And the bones of Joseph were brought from Egypt and buried too.
Genesis chapter 50. Joseph made the family promise, when I die, don't let me stay in Egypt. God is going to send us back. Please take my bones with you. And here they are from Genesis 50 to Joshua 24. We finally see that fulfilled.
Yeah, long time.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the book of Joshua ends, and now we move into the book of Judges.
Yeah.
So why is it so important to hop into Judges?
We're going to take a selection of chapter 1 and a selection of chapter 2. Because of Judges, right? And this really just finishes off the story because there's a little bit more taking over the land in chapter 1, and just to see how it unfolds and what doesn't happen, right? And then in chapter 2, we're going to read a few verses, and some of it's going to recap almost word for word, actually, what we saw in Joshua. Yeah. But then it gives sort of like the rest of the story, right? And it says that as long as Joshua was alive and the men around him, Israel did what they said they were going to do. But as soon as that generation was dead, they started worshiping these other gods and everything. And it's just a good reminder for us that, there's a saying that says that the church can be extinct within one generation. If we're not discipling, if we're not sharing the gospel. Now, again, humanly speaking, from God's view, it's never going to happen. But the Joshua Judges transition is a really good reminder that within one generation, everything can change drastically.
Well, that was the line, right? Because that generation did not see God in action, or know God.
Right. So you have generation 1 who was at the Red Sea and Sinai. Okay. You have generation 2, some of whom maybe were young enough that they didn't die, but they saw God providing in the wilderness, even if they didn't see the Red Sea.
Right.
They're the ones who went into the land. The next generation, they have things they didn't plant, cities they didn't build. It's just easy street for them because God's doing all this stuff. And what happens when you have no troubles and no adversaries and no everything?
Yeah, you get lazy. Yep. Okay, so I know we're going to hop into Judges, and we can't spend a lot of time on the background of Judges. But like you said, we had Moses, then we had Joshua. Who's the leader now after Joshua?
God. It was intentionally supposed to be a theocracy led by the priest, or managed by the priests.
So where do the judges come in there?
Well, the judges, the story of the judges comes in because the priests got corrupt, and the judges really were not meant so much to rule as they rescued the people every time they were oppressed and invaded. And the judges came in, and then they did end up ruling. Judges never should have happened. Had Israel followed God the way they were supposed to, God would have been the king. The priests would have been the emissaries between God and Israel. And then going all the way back to Exodus 19, Israel itself was called, and 1 Peter 2 repeats this, called a royal priesthood and a holy nation. As a nation, they were supposed to be a nation of priests for the rest of the world. So you have God, and then the priests within Israel, and then Israel as the place that leads the rest of the world to God. That's how it was supposed to function. That goes all the way back to Exodus 19. Peter brings that up with the believing Jews in 1 Peter 2. He says, you're still supposed to be leading people to God. You have a special place. It's not for the whole church. I mean, it is the church in a sense, but not exactly the way it was there. But yeah, I mean, the rest of Judges, we're not going to do the rest of Judges. Yeah, it's just, it never should. This book never should have happened. Never should exist.
Right. So one of the things that we do learn in Judges is, and we've alluded to it a number of times, they're in the Promised Land and the war is over, but yet there's still people there that need to be driven out.
Yeah.
So we still see groups of people banding with other groups of people,
Yep.
Whether it's fighting or just pushing people out of various lands. So it goes in there with what Simeon and Judah especially are named in there.
Yeah.
We see where Jerusalem is captured.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird to think that the nation of Israel has to go into Jerusalem and capture it because for so long it was theirs. Right.
Well,
but it wasn't always.
And it wasn't. In fact, Jerusalem, it says that they invaded it, they burned it, whatever. Eventually, the Jebusites got it back, and that's who David got it from 400 years later. Jerusalem still was not a major, we'll say, Israelite city until 400 years after Joshua, when David conquered it. Yeah.
Okay. Then in Judges 2, we see an angel of the Lord showing up, basically talking to the people, saying, "You dishonored me.
Yeah.
We told you not to do this, this, and this. You did this, this, and this. I'm done."
Yeah. And that's what kicks off the rest of the book of Judges, and this downward spiral where literally two key verses in the book of Judges are every generation was worse than the previous, circle in the drain, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's the whole book of Judges in two verses.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're not going through the whole book, but that's...
Yeah, but it is interesting, and it does make sense. These books flow to one another, and sometimes there's definitely a lot of repeat. And in this case, there's not a different ending, but a more complete part of the story.
Yeah,
which is nice.
Yeah. It sort of finishes off Joshua a little bit, as far as at least lets us know, so did they do it? Did they follow through?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, not so much.
No.
Right.
But as we wrap up this one, just a good reminder that what we do in this generation does affect not just our kids and our but grandkids and multiple generations out. We're still reading about the stuff because one generation didn't do what they were supposed to do. Here we are, 3,000 plus years later, still reading about this and seeing the fallout of it. So. Right. And hopefully learning from it, because that's Paul says everything was written for our example and for our instruction. So we should be learning from that. And God is faithful, and He has not let Israel be destroyed. He still has promises to fulfill to them, and He will indeed do that one day. And we look forward to being there when it happens. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little trek through the book of Joshua. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'd love to hear your questions and comments and your insights as you've been studying.
Definitely.
And we'll be back next time with a new study.
Bye, everybody.